Alright, hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking about how to beat the Slav defense with white. The Slav is obviously one of black's most solid openings against 1d4, and it's one that I have a bit of a love-hate relationship against. These days I'd say I have a pretty good thing going against it, but when I was younger I struggled against it a lot, so hopefully with some of the stuff that I say today, this will help you guys. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So to start off with, the very first line I'm going to rank is going to be the main line of the Slav defense with knight f3 and knight c3. And I'm going to be putting this in B tier, which might be a bit controversial. And so the main line, of course, is with knight f3 and knight c3 here, which is very principled and just follows basic chess principles. But there's some concrete reasons to why I'm putting this in B tier. Now the first of them is after d takes c4 here, white basically has to play like a4 and know a bunch of theory here, like e3. You don't have to know that much theory here, but the positions are still kind of like very strategically complicated, and it's not the easiest thing to play in the world. Or you could go for some sharp knight e5 stuff, which I used to play. I even showed an example in a video I made recently, opening theory is a scam, where I showed this very complicated line here, where after some moves like this, where black has the option between the f6, a very solid move, but also stuff like g5, a lot more of an aggressive move, and for example here, white's most popular moves to play knight e3, and in between with attacking this bishop, and there's all sorts of complicated stuff going on here. Although I will mention that you could avoid this sort of very heavy mainline theory if you wanted to by playing something like e4 called the Geller Gambit. And now I didn't bother making a separate, thing for this opening because it's very specific, but if it were just Geller Gambit, I might put this in A tier actually, since I think it's a very practical weapon, and guys like Magnus have started playing this recently. Like for example, after bishop e2 here, there's some, theory that goes on here, and I think white is actually doing pretty decent, so you might want to look into this if you're interested. However, aside from just the classical Slav, which is d takes c4, there's also some other lines you need to learn, like the semi-Slav here, and if you play e3 here, I would kind of question why you're even allowing like all this theory with d takes c4, when you could just play knight c3, and after knight f6, e3, when black's by far best move here is to go e6, transposing back to the position we just had after knight f3, but by doing it with this move order, we've avoided a bunch of junk, and I'm going to touch on this more later. But coming back to this point, it's like, okay, you don't have to play e3 though against the semi-Slav here. You have the extra option of bishop g5, but again, this leads to very sharp stuff, and to some people, this might be exactly what you're looking for, in which case, yeah, maybe ignore me and, this could be like an S tier opening for you, but personally, this is not what I'm into. You allow all sorts of stuff after h6 here. You could play the very solid Moscow, or you could go bishop h4 and allow all sorts of sharp stuff here, the Moscow Gambit. Not to mention other options, not just h6 here, but also d takes c4, and this would lead us into the Botvinnik variation of the semi-Slav defense, one of the most theoretical openings in chess, honestly. There's some crazy lines that go like 30, 40 moves deep, and you get forced draws. Are your opponents going to know this? Probably not, but it's just kind of worth keeping in mind that if you're going to learn these lines, there's a lot to learn, so do beware what you're getting yourself into. But one potential upside is that after knight c3 here, a6, because white hasn't committed to any e3 moves, there are some potential ideas like c5 we have against the Chebanenko Slav with a6, and in many of these lines what we're going to do with c5 is bishop f4 tends to mix well with this, and of course that wouldn't be possible if he had played e3, so this is kind of one potential upside of going for this whole knight c3 line, but it is a pretty small one if you ask me, when you have to take into account the whole classical Slav stuff you have to learn. But once again, this is why I'm putting this all in B tier. So given the line we had just talked about, I think it would be appropriate to talk about the knight c3 e3 line that I just mentioned, and this one goes right into S tier. So coming back to the starting position of the Slav here, we saw knight f3, knight c3 in the last example, and usually people in that line, I will mention, go knight c3 before they play knight c3, because after d takes c4 here, these lines aren't considered to be so dangerous, whereas after knight c3 immediately here and then d takes c4, these lines aren't necessarily anything to be too scared of. But the point is that now after e3 b5 here, now b4 could come at some point, kicking this knight away, which of course if the knight were in b1 and this knight were in f3 would not be such a problem. However, this still isn't really anything to be too concerned about. I think white should be gaining advantage in these positions. It's just something you need to take into account if you are going to play this knight c3 move order. And if you want to go knight c3, knight f6, e3, this is something you're going to have to deal with. But that being said, I think this line's very good, that's why I put it in the S tier. The reason is that the amount of lines you have to learn is not that great. D takes c4, like the classical Slav option we saw against the main line, it's not really something to be bothered about here. In general, Black's only two serious options are a6, well, e6, and also g6 is something you need to watch out for. The Psuedo-Black, it's not too scary, to be honest. It's very solid though. The Chebenenko, as we looked at earlier, is something you have to study, but the main line here is definitely e6, transposing into the semi-slav, and yeah, Black definitely is doing very solid here, but I'd say White also has a lot of promising ideas. For example, Queen c2 here, and a lot of these positions. And in general, if you're just looking for something which isn't too strategically complicated, offers good chances for an advantage, and while also having a bit of an aggressive tint to it, this could be a good option to choose. However, one thing I will mention is that one of the original ideas of this line was that after bishop f5 here, this wouldn't really be viable for Black due to the fact that it was considered that c takes d5, queen b3 here is just supposed to be good, because it's like if you play something like queen d7, now knight f3 and a quick knight e5 plus bishop b5 is very unpleasant. You don't really want to play b6, this weakens the light squares a lot after something like bishop b5 check, and now no matter where you go, you're just going to lose a pawn on d5. And if you also play queen b6 here, I believe this just simply loses a pawn to knight takes d5, and after takes there's hold this knight takes f6 thing, and this is just up a pawn for White here. However, what was sort of realized in the last few years actually, it's been a while actually, more than just a few years, but it's in this position here, Black can play knight c6 actually, gambit the b7 pawn, and just go bishop d7. And the idea now is that this queen is a little bit misplaced on b7 actually, and so we want to get it out of there as quickly as possible. But now after e5 here, actually no, sorry, I think it's rook b8 first, queen d1, and now e5, Black gains a very kind of big initiative now, and despite White being up a pawn, this gambit is, from what I understand, pretty sound for Black. It's been recommended in some books even, and the engine doesn't really show any clear way for White to gain an advantage. But that being said, that doesn't really take away too much from this line, to be honest. A lot of people don't even know this opportunity exists, so I'm going to keep this in the S tier. And so the next line we are going to be looking at here is going to be the exchange Slav, which has a bit of a boring reputation, and I thought that way about it for a while until I actually tried it myself. And it was then I realized that this is actually a very venomous line, and so for that reason I'm going to be putting it in A tier. So of course the exchange Slav, for you guys I assume would know, it's basically where White in this position goes c takes d5. You can also delay it like with knight c3, knight f6, and then c takes d5, but there's no real reason to, in my opinion. Like, why would you allow the possibility of d takes c4, for example, when you probably just want to play an exchange Slav? I don't know. But that being said, yeah, you can play it through different move orders. However, the main point, once again, with the exchange Slav is just simply that you want to get these positions where you're playing for a slight edge, sort of a risk-free advantage, so to speak, and go for these sort of positions like this. And now there are a bunch of different options, but one of the main ideas is that now after e6, you could play with knight f3 in a bunch of these positions, but there are some specific ideas related to delaying the development of the knight, and I want to show one of them right now. So basically the idea is that we keep delaying the development of the knight by playing moves like bishop d3. If Black plays a6, we play rook c1, another way to move. And if finally Black plays bishop e7, now we're going to play a move like h3 or knight f3. But the point is that if they play bishop d6, now we're going to take here, and we're going to play f4. And this is why we delayed the development of the knight on g1, because now we can play f4, knight f3, and we have this very nice Stonewall type setup. We have a lot of control over this e5 square. This knight can jump there to a very nice outpost. We have great attacking chances, and I've played this and I've had this in boots a ton of times. Very fun position to play, and it's like +1 or something. It's not, you know, what Black really wants. And coming back to this whole, like, you know, bishop e7 point here, the reason now once again we can play a move like knight f3 is that if Black wants to play bishop d6 now, they, you know, they've pretty much lost the tempo. And okay, sure, after this takes, we're not going to have their f4 thing, but we are up a tempo compared to, say, if we just did that here in this position, takes, and played knight f3, which of course we would not do. Or you could even play something like back in this position. You could even play bishop g3, but you know, this is a whole nother discussion. However, there are some more critical options in the exchange slot for black, such as getting their bishop outside the pawn chain here, and this is kind of why it's not like an S tier and it's an A tier, because, you know, black does have these more solid options other than just going e6. Like, if we had this every game, then this would be like ultimate S tier, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case. They have options like bishop f5. a6 is another very solid option, waiting for a move and then trying to get this out to a square like g4, for example, or maybe still f5, but from here it usually goes to g4. And yeah, like for example, bishop f5 here, the main line continues, queen b3, attacking this b7 pawn, and a very typical sort of maneuver, I guess you can call it, between both sides, and a little bit of a play that goes on is knight a5, attacking the queen while protecting b7. You see queen a4 check, bishop d7, and what White's idea is that with all these queen moves, at the end of the day, we're going to get queen c2 now, and in these positions, we have sort of won the mini battle, so to speak, with not allowing this bishop to stay outside the pawn chain. But black has also gotten some benefits. They have this open c file. This bishop isn't completely terrible in d7. They can put some pressure like this on the queen's side. I'd say that I still like white. I've had this in some blitz. I've had this over the board once, even in the game I won. But you know, this is fairly solid for black as well, it must be said. And on a similar note to the exchange Slav, I want to discuss the Boor Attack now, which I'm going to be putting in B tier. And so many of you may have not heard of the Boor Attack before. It's definitely a very sort of niche, I guess you could call, line against the Slav, which occurs in the exchange Slav, by the way. But the point is that now in this position, instead of going for bishop f4, what we're going to do is we're going to play this very spicy move f3, trying to go e4, play very aggressively like this. And the whole point is that after knight c6 here, we're not going to simply after takes play takes, because then we'd just be losing the pawn here like this, right? So what we instead do is we play d5, and after knight e5, f takes e4. And there's a bunch of theory that goes something like this here. I think after like e takes d5, there's bishop b5 check, or maybe it's e5. I can't completely remember, but these positions are supposed to be quite promising for white. And I should also mention, from what I'm seeing in the Lichess database at least right now, we've just been playing the main moves, like the last 3 or 4 moves or so, and basically after this move e5 from white, they've scored like 75-80% in the Lichess database, so definitely this line is no joke. However, the problem I have with this line, so to speak, is that black isn't really forced, for example, in this position to play e takes d5, and there's a bunch of like small opportunities at various points throughout this line to deviate from this sort of thing. Like for example, in this position, black would play bishop d6, simply taking control of the square. And in practice, black actually scores quite well from here. The engine also isn't too optimistic about white's position, so it's for kind of this reason, I can't exactly put this any higher than B tier. It's a great weapon, definitely in blitz, and maybe definitely like the under 2200 level OTB, this could be quite powerful. But I find it difficult to really look at this objectively and say it's any better than that. But that being said, if you're interested, I definitely recommend giving this one a shot. And also I should mention very quickly that after knight c3, knight f6, f3 is quite decent, but against knight c6, you can't really go f3, because here e5 is quite strong now, just blowing up the position, exploiting the fact we played this rather stupid looking move f3, right? And now after takes d4, and something like knight takes e5 should be fairly good for black. But here what white does have at their disposal here after knight c6 is to play in a similar fashion, just playing e4 immediately now. And for example, if d takes e4, which I don't think is so great actually, but also very natural, we can play d5, and after knight e5, queen a4 check. And here, white just has a very nice initiative. Black's kind of forced to play passively with moves like knight g6. I think this is a very nice position for white. Although there are some more critical tries here. For example, after e4, knight f6 could be an option. And f3 would actually transpose back to the board. Or you could play something like e5. And there's also another very solid move that black can play is e6. But this is a bit of a different discussion. And so changing gears a bit, we're going to be looking at a more positional line once again. And it's going to be the g3 line, sort of playing the spirit of the Catalan but against the Slav, and I'm going to be putting this in C tier. And so essentially the line we are going to be talking about here is with knight f3 and g3, the Fianchetto Variation. But I don't like this a whole lot here, and the reason is that black can simply develop their bishop outside the pawn chain, and you might say like, you know, big deal, right? But not really just big deal, because the thing is that if you compare this to something like, say, the Catalan here with e6, this is known to be a very strong opening for white. It's one that I play a lot personally, And it sort of does make this whole Fianchetto Variation against the Catalan have some appeal, because you can do the same thing almost, play it almost like an opening system, right? But the thing you have to understand is that in the Catalan, black often has this eternal struggle they're dealing with of this bishop on the light squares. Whereas when they play c6 here and knight f3, they're not really dealing with that same problem in the sense. So when we play g3 and we're essentially trying to get a Catalan, like for example here of e6 here, it's a very popular move in the Elite Chess database actually, where players from the black side don't seem to appreciate that they're actually just transposing into the Catalan. Like, this stuff is very pleasant for white, and I might make more videos on this in the future, but this is something I'd be very happy to see on the board here. We just have a very normal closed Catalan. However, the problem simply is that black doesn't have to do that. They can play bishop f5, they can play bishop g4, they could even play d takes c4, trying to sharpen things up actually. I'm not too sure what the theory is like here, but white also does have to be prepared to perhaps play a bit of a gambit. And I just want to say, it's not necessarily like the end of the world just because we're letting like these light squared bishops get outside the pawn chain. Like, that happens in a lot of lines in Slav. But it's just really that, like, to be able to play these positions in such a way that you will get an advantage very often, or at least be able to outplay the opponent, you have to have some very kind of concrete strategic knowledge of these positions, and that is something which for the majority of players isn't necessarily going to be so comfortable. Like, for example here, the really cutting edge stuff that the Grandmasters do in this line is like knight c3 and knight h4, and after bishop f4 we're going to f3. And to me this kind of looks a bit ugly. I probably wouldn't want to play like this, but you know, if you were keen to study this kind of thing is a possibility. And so somewhat of a similar line we're going to be discussing right now is this line with queen c2, and this is also going to go in C tier. And so the line I'm talking about is in this position once again, where we've seen a bunch of different ideas so far, knight c3, g3, but queen c2 is the move we're looking at here. And it sort of has a similar idea to the whole g3 setups, in the if black plays e6, we're going to be very happy to play g3 and go into this sort of closed Catalan position. So queen c2 is sort of a move. I actually came across this first in a book called Wojo's Weapons, based on this kind of old school American grandmaster who was dominating like the sort of open tournament circuit in America. He had this very interesting opening repertoire, and the book Wojo's Weapons was sort of built off of that, trying to give quad players this sort of accessible repertoire, which is sort of based on the idea of positional chess, outplaying your opponents without much effort, so to speak. And this was the line they recommended against the Slav, and I personally actually gave this a try because of that book. And aside from the whole e6 thing going into the closed Catalan once again, one of the critical lines is g6. And basically the point is that in a bunch of these lines here, what we're going to get is something where black could maybe play bishop f5 here and kick around the queen a little bit, but after queen b3, from what I understand, these positions after like c5 here, after something like this and this structure is supposed to be quite good for white, where they can play b4, b5 in the long run. And for example, one cool maneuver that has stuck in my head for quite a long time is something like this basically, where white is going to eventually maneuver their knight around to d2 to b3 and then to a5, attack this pawn on b7, which is very difficult for black to defend because they can't play moves like rook b8, because once again our bishop is on this long diagonal here. However, in practice this isn't always necessarily very easy to execute. For example here, let's just put a random way to move onto the board here. If knight d2 happened now, we lack control of the e5 square, and black would be able to break like this and perhaps put some pressure on us, so it's not always that clear cut. But that being said, these endgames in general I like a lot from a strategic point of view. What was more off-putting to me was, for example, in this position, a very concrete line that works very well for black is just c5 here. Playing in a very Grunfeld-like style here, except they've spent 2 tempi on c6 to c5, but they can kind of get away with it because we've also played a move queen c2, developing our queen to a square where it is a bit vulnerable, and these positions just sort of work out well for black. And another line that is sort of critical against this whole queen c2 thing is d takes c4, and there's some people who play e4 here and go into like this gambit after b5. I'm not sure I'm completely convinced with this, but it definitely is a playable option. What was more common, however, is queen takes c4, and you get these sort of positions which are, to be honest, I like these once again quite a lot from white's perspective here. Like, I think in this position here, this was in Wojo's Weapons, where white can play like e3 here, and there's this whole like plan where you treat the queen back to e2. You eventually try to expand the center with e4 later on, And I mean, this stuff I like quite a lot from white's perspective, I must say. But once again, there's this whole like g6 thing. I was never completely comfortable with it. Even like these endgames, I have to admit, it is a bit difficult to play because once again, there's always these e5 ideas you have to deal with. So yeah, it's just worth taking into consideration. But you know, if you're looking for something strategic, which would work quite well under 2000, for example, this might be quite good, but at the higher levels, there might be some problems. And so the next line I want to discuss is very similar to Queen C2 actually, and I'm going to be putting this in the B tier. This is this Queen B3 line, and it's often called a kind of cousin line of Queen C2, and we're going to see why very soon. So basically the whole point here is that after Queen B3 in this position here, if black plays d takes c4, which is kind of considered the main line, now we transpose to the line actually after Queen C2 here, d takes c4, Queen takes c4. One con, however, is sort of that after d takes c4, there's no gambit line with e4, where if that was what you want to play, you no longer have that option. But that being said, these positions, once again, as I discussed, very nice for white actually sometimes. They can be very strategically challenging for black to face, so nothing that I would be too opposed to getting on the board. However, something you do have to think about a little bit is after Queen B3, what are you going to be doing against E6 here? For example, you could play something like Bishop G5, you could also play Knight C3, which transposes into an interesting semi-slav line, or maybe you could even go G3, which is sort of a variation of the close Catalan, except the Queen's on B3, which I would argue is a bit suboptimal to the Queen being on C2, since you have less control over the E4 square, but that being said, it's still like decent, and I wouldn't really say this is as big of an issue as say the whole Queen C2 line, where there was the G6 stuff and the black would kind of exploit the queen, whereas here I don't see that as being as prevalent. And so another very similar line to the last two we've just discussed is going to be this line with knight b d2, and it's a bit of a toss up between B and C tier, to be honest. I'm going to put in C tier ultimately. So basically in this position, once again, that we've seen tons of times with a bunch of different moves. Here, knight b2 is the move we're talking about this time, and here black's most critical move is definitely bishop f5, as it is in a bunch of these Slav lines where white doesn't put a lot of pressure on d5 here. Something like e6, for example, isn't too critical. We can play e3, and this is going to be very similar to a line that I'm going to cover soon with e3 here, e6, and knight b d2, for example, is one of the main moves in this position. But coming back to knight b d2 here, bishop f5 is definitely by far the most common move here. G6 is also something which has me a little bit questioning of white's position. Usually the more critical setup against this kind of Slav would involve the knight being on c3, putting pressure on the d5 pawn, whereas here I'm not so impressed by the knight being on d2. That being said, it's not necessarily the end of the world, it's just like, I'm not sure if I'd actually want to play this with white. However, once again, the more critical approach is bishop f5, and here the whole point behind white's play is we're going to play knight h4, putting pressure on this bishop here. And a very nice trick actually happens after black's seemingly most natural move, bishop g6 here. And so basically what we're going to do is we're not going to snap the bishop off immediately. That would be a bit of an error actually. What we're going to do is we're going to play queen b3, putting pressure on the b7 pawn like this. And here black's move is actually to play queen c7 when they're not doing too bad, but after something like knight takes g6, for example, g3, I think white just has a nice position with the bishop pair here. We're doing pretty solid. The most common move by far in this position for black is to play queen b6 here. But this is actually a very brutal mistake, because after this very sneaky move, which if you'd like to try and find and pause the video, I suggest you do so, white can play queen h3 actually, sliding the queen over to this side of the board, which looks a little bit mysterious at first. But the whole idea is we're eyeing this c8 square right now. And you might say, okay, well, we can block that with a move like knight bd7. That is true, but after knight takes g6 here, notice how you can't recapture back for the h pawn. Well, you can, but you're going to lose a rook, which more or less compels black to play this. But after a position like this, now black's in a very awkward situation where they have this backward e pawn, a weak e6 square, and white actually just has a big advantage in this position, which was one of the things that made me want to put this in B tier. But the problem is that after this very accurate move, bishop e4, f3, and now bishop g6, notice that after something like queen b3, now queen b6, this queen h3 possibility is just not available, and so something like this just feels very mediocre, honestly, and I would have troubles recommending this for white. But that being said, this isn't necessarily terrible for white or anything. I'm just saying that personally, I would not go into this, so if you are willing to look into this and give this a shot, I recommend you do so. I should also mention that from like a practical perspective though, like knight bd2 is just so rare that most players probably would have never studied this before, so like there is a pretty good chance, right, they're gonna fall into this whole like bishop g6 thing. So you know that there is that really big appeal in this once again. Alright, and so I've been saving some of the nasty ones for last here, and it's gonna start off with what I'm gonna call like a pseudo-black diemer gambit here, which is e4 on move 3. So many of you may know the black diemer gambit after d4, d5, and white playing e4 here, and going for this whole everything like this. And this is a, you know, it's not a terrible gambit, I wouldn't play it myself, but it does have some venom. And essentially, black can sort of try and do the same thing in the Slav defense after e4 here. But I'm just not a fan of this, to be honest. It doesn't really make sense to me. It feels way too slow having played the c4 move, which sort of might not be so obvious, but to me it really does feel like it creates a lot of weaknesses in white's position. And after knight c3 here, e5 is a very active way to counter-strike in the center here, exploiting the fact that once again black's played like the c4 move, kind of messing around a bit, and I just don't rate these positions too highly at all. If you take on e5 for example, I think just something like takes bishop f5, knight d7 picks up the pawn soon, and not only can white not castle, but there's all these weaknesses in the position, they might even end up down a pawn. I find it very difficult to believe in this sort of thing. Like, sure, you don't have to take on e5, then you'd play a move like d5, but now I don't know, something like bishop c5 might be possible, bishop b4 exploiting the weak dark squares black has in their position, and I am not at all a fan of this for white. And so another not so great line is going to be 3c5. This one also goes in the F tier, and I'm gonna keep this one very brief. So this one I used to face a lot back when I was in like primary school, or just when I was a young kid. I played this Slav defense a bit back then, not that I really knew what I was doing, but I did, and for some reason c5 is just something people love doing. It sort of makes sense from the perspective if you see like, for example, e4, c6, d4, d5, in the Caro-Kann, e5 is very common. The advanced variation against French defense is also very normal when the pawn is attacked to push the pawn like this. However, by analogy, it doesn't really work the same way in the Slav defense, not Caro-Kann, because here c5 is playing more on the flank, whereas in the other lines e5 at least gains space in the center. This pawn can be chipped away against in multiple ways. b6 for example is very logical. Another option is to play e5, I think this is even stronger, undermining the center of the pawn chain, d4 pawn, and if white dares to take this, they drop the c5 pawn, which they spent so much time pushing up. This e5 pawn is also a strength rather than a weakness, I believe, and black is also just ahead in development, so there's nothing really good or redeeming about white's position here. And now we're going to look at another kind of pair of lines similar to how we looked at queen c2 and queen b3 earlier. The next two lines we're going to be looking at are quite similar, but they're also quite bad. So the first one's going to be for bishop g5 here. And so the whole line we're going to be looking at here is one that occurs after knight c3 here. Once again, this option is available, but it allows d takes c4. And here, you know, e3 is probably the move you should play. But some crazy people are going to try and develop the bishop outside the pawn chain. Which if black played e6 and you get e3, this makes sense. This is decent for white. And a lot of black players will in fact allow white to get away with this, but something you have to understand, especially if you play the Slav defense as black, is that if white plays a move like this, very often what you can do is, if you apply the logic here that, like, say for example knight f3, d takes c4, and that this is a sound line, you can sort of apply the logic that if white does anything except protect the c4 pawn, if I just take it, probably nothing bad will happen. And that's exactly kind of what happens here. If white plays a move like bishop g5, like sure they can play e3, but just b5, we protect this pawn here. And maybe white has some compensation, but in general, to me it just feels like black is up a pawn. And yes, white could play more actively with e4, but still b5, and like, I mean, what, you're going to play e5? That's not really a big deal at all. Black, to me, just feels like they're a pawn up, and it feels very difficult to justify a move like bishop g5 here, which is why it goes in the F tier. And likewise here, once again, there's this bishop f4 line, and so bishop g5, this is sort of the cousin line to bishop g5, but this one's also going to be going in the F tier. And I'm not even bothered going to put it on the board, to be honest. It's the exact same reason. Black just plays d takes c4, b5, and there's no real way I can justify this line for white in my opinion. Black just feels like doing well. And this is going to bring us to the last line of today, which I'll save for last. It's my personal favorite against the Slav. Some would call it the slow Slav. It's personally what I call it, and we're going to be putting this all the way up in S tier. And basically the slow Slav is a line that occurs after knight f3, knight f6, and e3. It's very similar to knight c3, knight f6 and e3, but there are some key differences I'm going to explain. And so the very first one is that in the slow Slav here, the e6, the Meron variation of the semi-slav, which is usually what this is called, right? Now, white could go knight c3 and transpose back to that, or we don't have to, and we can instead do is play a move like knight bd2, as I mentioned earlier. Or what I personally like to play, b3. I feel like this is a bit more accurate, at least the way I like to play it. I like to not commit the knight to d2 too early. I prefer to keep the knight going to c3 as an option. And a lot of the time that is what I do from these positions. For example, something that happens a lot is going to look like this here. And the original idea used to be like white would play in this position, you know, something like knight b2, knight e5, f4. But this stuff has been analyzed pretty deeply, and to be honest, I'm not completely convinced that white is doing so amazingly here as a lot of people might think, which is personally why I like to go for these knight c3 setups, developing the knight more to the center, putting pressure like this on d5, for example. And in general, I like these positions quite a lot for white. I even won a very nice game actually against an FM last year. I made a video on that at the start of the year. You can go check it up in the card. It's called my best game of 2022. So coming back to this position here after e3, once again we're seeing the effect of e6 sort of being nullified quite a bit due to this b3 line. Which, by the way, the whole idea of is sort of the, like, if you look at a bunch of these lines in the Slav here, basically what we're seeing over and over again is a d takes c4 takes and b5. Sorry, not that. b5 and black gets a lot of counterplay, right? Whereas once we play b3 here, that's not really possible because now it takes, can simply be with b takes c4 here. There's no tempo now with b5, and now white simply has a nice pawn center mass, and this isn't really so good for black. Also, I should mention, why, for example, in this position here, like, why can white not just go knight bd7, sorry, knight c3, knight bd7, and b3 here? What is the difference? And well, this is a good question actually, and basically it comes down to a very concrete fact of black can play bishop b4 here, attacking this knight on c3, and if we go bishop b2 here, black can play like a very quick knight e4, queen a5, put pressure on this knight on c3, and this is very difficult to deal with. Or we could play something like bishop d2, and we sort of misplace this bishop here like this, and after queen e7, I just don't like these positions. The bishop's going to be coming back to d6 later. Black will get in a quick e5 maybe. And our bishop is meant to be on b2. This was not its destiny to come to d2. That it just does nothing here. Which is why we have to play this very accurate move order of b3 here. I mean, you don't have to do anything technically, but if you want a good position, this is what I would do. However, once again, sorry, that was a bit of a long rant. What I really want to say was that, okay, this e6 stuff dealt with. So what's the sort of downside of this line? Because you can't get everything in chess. That's just not how it works, at least most of the time. So the drawback is that bishop f5 is sort of a possibility, right? We saw in the other line with knight c3, e3, we could get a quick queen b3. Whereas here, that's not really as strong. So what we have to do is knight c3, e6, and knight h4 here. Similar to what we saw in the knight bd2 line. I would argue this is definitely a better version though. And one reason is simply that we have our knight on the more active c3 square. And there's a bunch of different lines for black here. Bishop g4 is kind of considered the worst one. Bishop e4 and bishop g6 are the main lines, and there's a bunch of theory here. Bishop e4 I think is technically the main line among the top players these days, but that being said, bishop g6 is also very viable. But yeah, these positions I don't mind playing it all off white. I've got them quite a bit in practice, more so on blitz than I have OTB, but still I know these positions quite well, I'd like to think. And yeah, I don't really see this as a con that we are allowing these lines. There is also bishop g4, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain like this. And here we can play a very quick h3, forcing either the bishop to go back or take, giving up the bishop here. I'm very happy to see these positions on the board. And another thing is bishop h5. And we can play a quick g4 and knight e5. Try and put pressure like this on black, and to be honest, I'm also quite happy with these positions. And as we're wrapping this one up, I should add that Back in this position here, once again, there were other options in the knight 3 e3 line, which is still possible here. G6, the Shutter, and A6, the Chepenenko. These are still very well and alive against the semi-slav as well, so you have to study up on these. But overall, I found the semi-slav, just to be over the years, is a very reliable weapon. You can sort of compare to a lot of other lines, especially since you don't have to deal with a lot of like the sort of sharp semi-slav type stuff here with like Queen C2 or whatever, and you know, black taking on C4. These positions just naturally lend themselves to concrete fury. This line, like depending on your level, the amount of fury your opponents will know will vary a bit, but still, I just preferred to avoid this. And with E3, I felt like I could avoid this, get good positions without knowing excessive amounts of fury, and still be able to outplay my opponents and, do all that good stuff. So to me, it just wasn't really clear what the drawback was, and that's why it's been my main line for many years now against the Slav. But with that being said, that pretty much wraps up the video. Hope you guys found this useful. If it was, leave a comment down below what tier list you'd like to see. Against other openings, I'm open to any suggestions. Also, of course, subscribe, like to the channel, whatnot. And anyways, that just about wraps things up. So I hope you all have a good day, and I'll see you until next time.